Welcome to Thread of Terror. We bring you the creepiest stories from Reddit. Dim the lights, grab a blanket, and hit subscribe so you never miss a scare. People who have experienced paranormal activity, what is your story? Story 1. Face in the closet.
I grew up in a house that had a dark history. It originally served as an old folks' home. From the moment we moved in, the atmosphere felt heavy, as if the house itself had absorbed the echoes of its past. At night, the entire structure would creak and groan as though it were alive. The sounds often mimicked the rhythm of footsteps, like someone slowly ascending and descending the stairs in the dead of night. My mother was convinced the house was haunted. My father, ever the skeptic, dismissed it as just the house settling. However, considering the house was already a century old by 1984, the unexplained occurrences were hard to ignore. One night, I was startled awake by the distinct sound of a door slamming. The noise was sharp and abrupt, breaking the stillness of the night. Heart pounding, I ventured out of my room, drawn by a mixture of curiosity and fear. I crept down the hall and peered cautiously around the corner, my gaze drawn toward the staircase. At the base of the stairs stood a small closet, its door slightly ajar, no more than 6 to 8 inches. And then I saw it. From the dim recess of the closet, a pale human face stared back at me. Its expression was unreadable, its presence chilling. I froze in place, unable to process what I was seeing. Fear surged through me, and I bolted into the bathroom, slamming the door behind me. I sat there, trembling, trying to steady my breath and summon the courage to investigate further. Was it a trick of the light, my imagination running wild? Or was it something much worse? Eventually, I forced myself to step out of the bathroom and look again. With every nerve in my body on edge, I leaned over the banister and glanced toward the closet. It was empty. The door hung open, just as before, but the face was gone. This was not an isolated incident. Over the years, my family and I experienced countless moments in that house that defied explanation. The eerie presence and strange occurrences became part of our lives, but they never stopped sending shivers down my spine.
Story 2. Paralyzed by fear.
When I was younger, around 5 years old, I experienced something that still haunts me to this day. One night, I went to bed as usual, but I was startled awake by the sound of faint whispering. At first, I thought it was just my imagination and tried to ignore it. But then I distinctly heard a voice say, "Hey, psst." Curious and frightened, I opened my eyes and scanned the room. That was when I saw it. A black dog with glowing yellow eyes, standing upright on 2 legs. Its gaze felt unnaturally piercing, and its presence radiated an aura of menace. Frozen in fear, I let out a terrified scream and began crying uncontrollably. I yelled for my parents, desperate for their help. When they rushed into the room, the creature darted behind a chair, disappearing from sight. I pointed toward the chair, begging them to look, but they saw nothing. I was so shaken that I refused to sleep in my room for a week, and instead stayed with my parents. Although I never saw the creature again in real life, its image continued to haunt me in my dreams. In these recurring nightmares, the black dog would appear again, radiating the same sinister energy. It had a terrifying ability. It could paralyze me, rendering me completely immobile. I would watch helplessly as it demonstrated this horrifying power right in front of my parents. Strangely, they would never react or try to help, as if they could not see or sense the creature's presence. Each time I woke up trembling with fear, unable to shake the vivid memory of those dreams. Years later, I came across something that sent chills down my spine. I learned that people in Turkey and other parts of the world have reported experiencing similar entities in their dreams. They call it the jinn, a supernatural being from folklore. It is said that the jinn visits its victims in their rooms, immobilizing them and holding them down, sometimes even suffocating them. Although I never experienced suffocation, the jinn's description matched the black dog from my childhood perfectly. Even now, just thinking about that experience fills me with dread. I still wonder if it was all a dream, a child's imagination, or something far more sinister.
Story 3. Children's laughter.
When I was 10 years old, my family lived in a house that I now believe was haunted. It was just my 3 sisters and me at the time, ages 13, 5, 2, and myself. My older sister and I were home from school, both recovering from a stomach bug. My mom had gone to pick up my 5-year-old sister from school and asked us to watch our youngest sibling. We were sitting in the living room while the baby ate snacks and sipped water from her cup. At some point, the cup must not have been screwed on tightly, because when she knocked it over, water spilled everywhere. My older sister went to the kitchen to grab some napkins, and when she returned, she handed me a few so we could clean up the mess together, as we were on our hands and knees wiping the floor. We suddenly heard a loud bang coming from the second floor. My sister and I froze, staring at each other in silence. Without saying a word, it was clear we both thought, "You heard that too, right?" Trying to shake it off, we went back to cleaning. But then, another bang came from upstairs, louder this time. We stood up, still silent, our eyes fixed on the ceiling. That was when we heard it, faint giggling. It sounded like children laughing, but neither of us could understand how or why. The laughter quickly turned into singing, a haunting melody, like a children's choir softly performing a song we could not make out. Terrified, my sister scooped up the baby and we bolted out the door. It was a clear day when we stepped outside, but strangely, as soon as we reached the porch, it started to rain. We had no choice but to stay outside until my mum came home, unsure of what we had just experienced. Even after 20 years, I still have nightmares about that house. Oddly enough, the memory of the giggling and singing haunts me the most. There were other things we saw in that house, but for some reason, those eerie sounds stay with me in the darkest hours of the night.
Story 4. Footsteps in the haunted Winchester Mystery House.
I used to work in the Winchester Mystery House. For those who don't know, it's a mansion built by the heiress to the Winchester Rifle Company. She constructed the mansion with confusing rooms, doors, and stairways that lead to nowhere, in order to confuse the ghosts of those who were killed by the Winchester rifle. Over the years, there had been numerous ghost sightings by employees, and it was officially listed as a haunted house. I worked in the office and answered phones, which happened to be one of the 160 rooms in the mansion. One of my jobs was to inform the tour station when the last tour exited. As my office was near the end of the tour route, and I could hear the footsteps of the tour group, one day around 6 p.m. as I was closing up, I heard footsteps in the house and informed the tour station that the last tour was about to exit. They told me that the last tour had left the house about an hour earlier. My first thought was that it must have been my manager on patrol. When he came back into the office, I asked him if he was in the house, and he said no, he had been in the gift shop. He told me that he had closed it up and that absolutely no one was in the house. As he was saying this, we continued to hear footsteps in the house above us. We looked at each other with that look you give someone when you don't know what's going on. He and 2 other people went into the house to look for the source of the footsteps, thinking it was a guest who had gotten lost. They walked into the exact same room where I was hearing the footsteps and saw that there was no one there. When they came back into the office, we just sat in our chairs until 8 p.m., listening to the footsteps as they wandered around the house. None of us really acknowledged what we were hearing because we wanted to believe it was just the house creaking. However, these sounds did not resemble creaking at all. They were distinct with the cadence of footsteps. I'll never quite know what it was that was above us that day. Perhaps there is a logical explanation. Let's just say I didn't sleep well for about a month after that event.
Story 5. Ghostly Old Woman.
Almost 20 years ago, when I was still living at home with my parents, something happened one night that would stay with me forever. I was lying in bed, the familiar weight of my cat resting on my chest. She always slept close to me, her face facing mine, as if guarding me in the stillness of the night. I was fast asleep when, out of nowhere, I woke up in the middle of the night. At first, everything seemed normal, but then I froze. There, standing at the foot of my bed, was a ghostly figure of an old woman. She was staring straight down at me, her presence so cold it sent a shiver through my body. Her face was gaunt, and her short, greying hair framed her face in an unsettling way. Her arms hung straight down by her sides, and she seemed to be just watching me. The eerie thing was that her colouring was unlike anything I'd ever seen, almost like a black and white photograph, but sepia-toned, muted and lifeless. I blinked, convinced I was still dreaming, and tried to dismiss it as just a trick of my mind. But then, everything changed. My cat, who had been peacefully sleeping on my chest, suddenly hissed violently. Her claws dug into my chest as she jerked her head toward the figure. Her eyes locked onto the old woman, and she continued hissing, her fur standing on end as she stared in absolute terror. This was the moment I truly woke up. My cat, who had always been calm and affectionate, was now a frantic mess, fully aware of something I could not comprehend. I could feel the panic rising in me as I tried to calm her down, but my own fear was overwhelming. I was shaking. My heart raced as I realized the old woman wasn't a product of my imagination, she was really there. I moved my hand over my cat's fur, feeling the electricity of her fear, but nothing could calm her. The room felt suffocating, the air thick with dread. I did the only thing I could think of. I pulled the covers over my head, burying myself in them, praying that whatever I had seen would disappear. I stayed like that for the rest of the night, trembling beneath the sheets, too scared to look up. I had always been a skeptic before that night, dismissing ghost stories as mere fiction. But what I saw that night couldn't be explained away. If it hadn't been for my cat reacting the way she did, looking at something I couldn't see and hissing in fear, I might have convinced myself it was just a bad dream But now, I know what I saw. I've never experienced anything like it again, but I can still remember the way her hollow eyes stared down at me, and the chill that filled the room. A little background on my dad's house. It was built in the late 1970s. And I've always been told it was a deceased estate before it was sold in the early 1990s. It passed through another family before my dad purchased it in 1999. He's lived there ever since. I never thought much about the house's past until that night. The old woman, for some reason, reminded me of my grandmother, but I knew it wasn't her. I didn't recognize her, and there was no personal connection. But still to this day, the image of her standing there, watching me, lingers in my mind, haunting me in the quiet hours of the night.
Story 6. Mysterious Shaking Cup.
This story dates back to 1998, when I was 14 years old. My father had passed away the previous summer, and I was still adjusting to life without him. One evening, I was in the basement watching television, while my mum was in the living room directly above me, also watching television. If my mum needed my attention, she would stomp on the floor to let me know. This was her way of avoiding the hassle of yelling down the stairs, which were located on the other side of the house. That evening, she stomped on the floor more forcefully than usual and began calling my name loudly. It was far more insistent than her usual method of getting my attention. So I quickly ran upstairs, passing through the kitchen and dining room to the living room. When I got there, I saw my mum sitting in her chair in front of the television. A solid wood TV table was in front of her, positioned perfectly flat on the floor. On the table sat a large styrofoam cup, empty, with nothing else around it. The cup was shaking. And not just a small wobble, it was shaking wildly, almost lifting off the table, spinning around and moving erratically like it was doing some kind of bizarre dance. Mom explained that she had just finished drinking from it, placed it on the table, and suddenly it started moving like that. It was incredibly strange. All the windows were closed. There was no fan on. And I carefully checked the table for any signs of strings or mechanisms that might explain the movement. There was nothing. Curious and slightly unnerved, I even picked up the cup and put it back on the table. To my astonishment, it immediately began shaking again. I looked down to check if my mum was somehow shaking the table with her feet. But her feet were nowhere near it. The table itself was completely still. It was only the cup that was moving. My mum then suggested, almost casually, maybe it is your dad. I nervously responded, Dad, please stop. This is scaring me. Before I could even finish speaking, the cup suddenly stopped moving. Just like that, it was completely still. I waited a few moments, watching intently. But it did not move again. To this day, I have no explanation for what happened. I have thought about it countless times and discussed it with my mum on multiple occasions. Despite my efforts, I have never been able to reasonably explain or debunk it. It remains one of the most inexplicable and eerie experiences of my life.
Story 7. Camping on Bluff Mountain.
I was camping in the 1980s on Bluff Mountain, between the Blue Ridge Parkway and the Punch Bowl Shelter. This area is part of the Appalachian Trail, and you can basically camp anywhere off the dirt roads or trails. My friends and I were camped about halfway up Bluff Mountain for a week. On the second to last day, we decided to do a day hike up to the top of the mountain, taking our time to explore on the way up. When we reached the summit, we discovered the old fire tower foundations. While exploring further, we stumbled upon the Otti Klein Powell Memorial. For those unfamiliar, Otti was a young boy who tragically passed away on the mountain over a century ago. Finding this powerful memorial in such a remote place, especially without prior knowledge of its existence, this was the 1980s, long before the internet, was profound and deeply moving. We spent time reflecting on the story and discussing it before hiking back to our camp. That night, we decided to sleep outside our tents, as the weather was beautiful and it was our last night on the mountain. The three of us arranged our sleeping bags next to the fire, spaced a few feet apart. As usual, we dozed off to sleep. Around 3 a.m., like clockwork, we heard a train whistle faintly in the distance. It was almost comforting, because it signaled that dawn was just a few hours away. Not long after the whistle, I began stirring in my sleeping bag when I heard something moving nearby. When camping in such remote places, the stillness of the night amplifies even the slightest sounds. I reached over and nudged my friend to alert him. The sound grew louder, heading straight for us. Suddenly, the noise stopped. Standing directly in front of us in our camp were two men holding shotguns and a lantern. They were dressed in overalls, boots, and hat. While the shotguns were not raised, their presence in the middle of nowhere at night was unnerving. I had the only weapon we brought for the trip, a CO2-powered pellet gun, hidden in my sleeping bag. It was meant to deter animals and was utterly inadequate against two armed men. The situation felt like a standoff. None of us moved or spoke. They shined their lantern toward us, and we stared back, terrified. Without a single word exchanged, the men turned around and walked away. We waited in silence until the sound of their footsteps faded into the distance. Once they were gone, we quickly discussed what had just happened. Overwhelmed by fear, we decided to pack up immediately and leave. Before sunrise, we were off the mountain and back in our car. Years later, I began researching the Otti Klein Powell Memorial and the history of the area. Through local historians, I was connected to a professor writing a book about Otti and his family. When I shared my story, he suggested that we might have encountered ghosts rather than living individuals. According to the professor, many similar stories have been reported over the years. He believed we might have crossed paths with spirits of search parties that scoured the mountain in the late 1800s, tirelessly looking for the missing boy. The idea that the men we encountered were not moonshiners or poachers, as I had originally assumed, but spectral figures tied to a tragic piece of history, was something I had never considered. To this day, I cannot explain what happened on Bluff Mountain, but the memory remains vivid and haunting.
Story 8. Ghost in the Walls.
A friend of mine lived in a very old building, constructed in the early 1800s, in a small and historic town in Texas. His apartment was located upstairs, while businesses occupied the lower floors. The entire building had originally been a small factory but had since been remodeled for more modern purposes. There were several peculiar features in the apartment that hinted at its original purpose. such as a small door in the closet that seemed to lead to an empty space between the walls. It had no clear function, and my friend could not figure out why it was there. Occasionally, that small door would blow open unexpectedly, letting in a blast of freezing cold air. My friend chalked it up to quirks in the building's remodeling issues with ventilation or something similar. He noticed strange noises coming from behind the door as well, but again dismissed them as part of the old building's character. Another odd feature was the windows. They would always end up open random windows throughout the apartment. Neither my friend nor his girlfriend had opened them. Every time he found one open, he would close it, only to discover later that it had opened again. At first, he assumed the latches were faulty and not worth worrying about. One day, he stayed home from work. While he was there, he heard the sound of a window unlatching. Then, a moment later, he heard another window unlatch, and then another. In sequence, as if someone was walking through the living room, opening them one by one. Finally, he heard all the windows fall open simultaneously. That was enough for him. He quickly left the apartment for the rest of the day. When he returned that weekend to investigate, things seemed back to normal. Nothing unusual happened for a while, until about a month later, when his girlfriend experienced the exact same phenomenon while she was home alone. Despite the eerie occurrences, they both adjusted to it, accepting the strange behavior of the windows as just another quirk of the apartment. Things took a more unsettling turn when they got a dog. The puppy was naturally happy and playful, full of energy and curiosity. But everything changed when the small door in the closet blew open, or when the windows unlatched themselves. In those moments, the dog would freeze completely still. Its eyes would focus on something unseen, and it would slowly track an invisible presence moving around the room. The sight was chilling. No one else could see what the dog was looking at, and it only behaved this way when other strange events were occurring. After witnessing this happen several times, my friend and his girlfriend decided they had had enough. They moved out of the apartment shortly afterward, leaving the unexplained events behind.
Story 9. Midnight Doorknob.
I have never considered this a paranormal experience, but it remains the most unsettling moment of my life. It defies explanation, so I am left with no choice but to view it as something beyond the ordinary. My sister and I shared a bedroom while visiting our childhood home one summer. One night, we were startled awake by a loud jostling at our bedroom door. The sound was unmistakable. Someone was aggressively twisting and turning the doorknob as though trying to force their way inside. We exchanged wide-eyed glances, unease quickly replacing the remnants of sleep. The noise was relentless, and whoever or whatever it was did not speak. There were no whispers, no shouts, just the unnerving clatter of the doorknob being shaken violently. Could it be Dad? I whispered to my sister, though I already knew it made no sense. Our father worked night shifts and always informed us if he was coming home early. Besides, why would he act so erratically at 2 a.m? My sister, visibly shaken, whispered back, "I do not think so." Her fear only deepened mine. The possibility of it being a family member was slim. Our grandmother and 2 aunts were sound asleep in nearby rooms, none of them known for nocturnal wandering. Calling out, I asked, "Dad?" The response was silence, save for the relentless assault on the knob. Panic and curiosity overpowered caution, and I opened the door, peering into the dark hallway. My sister gasped, begging me not to. To our disbelief, the hallway was empty. The jostling stopped the instant I turned the knob, and the silence that followed was deafening. I stepped out, calling for my father, but there were no footsteps, no retreating shadow, no evidence of anyone at all. My sister and I locked the door again, hearts pounding. Just as we began to relax, the rattling resumed, more desperate and frenzied than before. This went on for hours. At times the force was so intense we feared the door might give way. We lay frozen, drenched in sweat, paralyzed by fear. The sound would occasionally stop, only to return moments later, more erratic and unsettling. By the time it finally ceased, exhaustion had overtaken us. We drifted into an uneasy sleep. The next morning we recounted the ordeal to each other in disbelief. When we asked our father, he confirmed he had come home late but had not approached our room. The house itself was undisturbed, no signs of intruders, no broken locks. Even now, we struggle to explain what happened that night. We have no belief in the supernatural, yet we are left with no rational explanation for the terrifying hours we endured.
Story 10. The Basement Game.
I was at my best friend's house in middle school. She had a Ouija board and was mildly interested in things like that. It was not something my parents would have allowed, so I enjoyed staying at her house on weekends because I had more freedom there. That night, we had another friend over too, and it was late. We were in her finished basement doing typical middle school girl things, talking about boys, imagining the future, and just having fun. They started talking about a game called Light as a Feather, Stiff as a Board, where someone lies on their back and the others place their fingertips underneath while reciting a phrase. The idea was that our energy would somehow lift the person, like some kind of levitation trick. We decided to try it. We arranged tea-light candles for ambience, and our second friend volunteered to lie down. My best friend and I placed our hands underneath her and began chanting the phrase. At first we were giggling and not taking it too seriously, but after a while, we started to focus. We must have been doing it for a solid 2 minutes when something unexpected interrupted us, my friend's dog. She had an older Welsh corgi who had been peacefully snoozing on the couch. Suddenly he woke up, walked over to us, and started staring intently at the far end of the basement. That part of the basement was fairly dark, with stairs leading up to the main floor and a side door to the laundry room. Then he started growling. It was midnight, and there was no one awake upstairs. The house was quiet, and we could not see or hear anything unusual. But the dog stood there, rigid, his growls growing louder and more intense. His reaction made us panic. There was something deeply unsettling about it. The worst part, the light switch for that half of the basement was on the far wall, the same side the dog was staring into. To make matters worse, the stairs leading upstairs were also in that direction. A wave of fear washed over me. It was not the kind of fear you feel about bad grades or disappointing your parents. This was deeper, almost primal, like something instinctual was warning me that we were not safe. We found a small flashlight and clung to each other, gathering our candles and turning on every lamp we could reach in our part of the basement. Finally, we worked up the courage to make a run for it, with the dog following closely behind us. We ran straight to the stairs, turned on the overhead fluorescent lights, bright and obnoxious, but suddenly comforting. and bolted up to the main floor. Once there, we locked the basement door behind us, and I think we might have even barricaded it just to be safe. We huddled in my friend's room at the other end of the house with her dog, too scared to go back. Even now, I cannot explain what happened that night. It still gives me the creeps.
Thanks for joining us on this terrifying adventure. If tonight's story gave you chills, let us know in the comments below and share your own scary experiences too. Don't forget to leave a like if you want more nightmares and subscribe if you haven't already. Until next time, sleep tight and remember, not all shadows are empty.